Back to the Hardy Boys, the Great Airport Mystery, Chapter 19, Hideout Trap. The storm had now become a raging fury. Huge waves crashed against the hull of the amphibian, causing it to heave violently. "Those anchor ropes aren't going to hold," Jerry yelled. "What about putting out more lines?" suggested Frank. "We have extra rope aboard," said the pilot, "but what do we attach it to? We haven't any more anchors." "I can carry the other ends of the ropes to shore in the raft and tie them to the rocks," Frank replied. "Too dangerous!" Jerry shouted above the wind. "The raft would be swamped in a sea like this." "We have no choice," Frank answered. "We'll have to take the chance." Frank worked his way aft and picked up 2 coils of rope. Joe and the others pitched in to help. Climbing outside and clinging to the heaving fuselage, they fastened one end of the coil of rope to the tail, the other end to the bow. Carrying both coils with him, Frank jumped into the raft and began paddling toward shore, beating out lengths of rope behind him. The raft pitched violently in all directions. Then suddenly a towering wave crashed over the young detective. The paddle was yanked from his hand and the raft turned over. "Frank! Frank!" shouted Joe. Suddenly his brother's head bobbed up in the tossing sea. He still clung to one of the ropes. Joe and the others grabbed it at their end and began hauling him in. As Frank neared the hull, another wave hit and slammed him against the plane. Although dazed by the blow, he continued to cling to the rope. Finally, he was hauled aboard. They all climbed back inside the airplane. "Good try, Frank," said Kurt Lerner. "Too bad I got swamped." "Oh, what do we do now?" Joe asked as he felt the plane lurch hard against the anchor ropes. "I have an idea," said Jerry. "It's our last chance." Scrambling forward, he strapped himself into the pilot's seat. There he pumped the throttles a few times, worked the fuel primers, and turned on the engine ignition switches. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked. "Try to meet the storm on its own terms," Jerry said grimly. "If we can get started, I can head into the wind and try to ride it out." He engaged the engine starters. The propellers turned slowly, but the engines failed to respond. At that instant, a series of massive waves spilled over the plane. The craft heaved violently, snapping first one anchor rope, then the other. The plane began to drift rapidly toward the jagged rocks on shore. Jerry continued to work the starters, but the engines would not respond. "The engine harnesses must be wet." The pilot's voice held a note of helplessness. Chet looked out. The rocks were getting closer. "We'll be smashed to pieces," he yelled, taking a deep breath. Frank rushed forward and climbed into the seat beside Jerry's. Frantically, he tried to help with the starting procedure. "We'd better get ready to jump overboard," Jerry declared as he glanced at the deadly rocks looming up in front of his window. Frank and Jerry continued to work the throttles and engage the starters. Suddenly, the right engine backfired a few times, then burst into life. Using the one engine, Jerry swung the plane around and headed into the wind and oncoming waves. By applying full power, he was able to halt the craft's drift toward the rocks. "Oh, that was close," Frank said, sighing in relief. "We're not out of this yet," Jerry said. "With only one engine running, we have to apply so much power to hold our position that we're likely to burn out the motor." He again tried starting the left engine. Finally, his persistence paid off. The engine backfired once, then roared in response. Jerry eased the throttles ahead and pulled still farther away from the rocks. He reduced power sufficiently to hold their position, yet prevent the engines from overheating. "Great job," said Frank, and Jerry gave a wry smile. The waves continued to batter the plane. Water seeped in through the seams around the windows and the door, making it necessary for the occupants to bail constantly. "How can the plane take this pounding?" Frank asked. "It's a strong ship," Jerry answered. "Also, the fact that we're in a cove is helping to take some of the kick out of the waves." The wind and the rain continued to rage. Jerry glanced at the fuel gauges. "If this storm doesn't end soon," he observed gloomily, "we'll run out of fuel. Then we'll really be in trouble." Gradually, however, the rain and gusts of wind seemed to diminish in activity. "I think the storm is moving off, Joe said happily. You're right, Jerry agreed. As night fell, the rain stopped and the wind subsided to a gentle breeze. Switching on the plane's bright landing lights, the pilot carefully taxied to a narrow part of the cove. Retrieving the rope which they had attached to the bow of the plane, Frank and Joe swam ashore and tied the end around a rock. Meanwhile, Lerner and Vogel had tied the stern line to another rock at the opposite side of the cove. Satisfied that the airplane was now secure, the whole group fell exhausted on the beach and slept soundly through the remainder of the night. The next day, after a breakfast from the plane's store of provisions, Jerry began an examination of the craft for damage. The Hardys, with Chet, Lerner, and Vogel, set out to collect the drums of aviation gasoline. It was long, arduous work. Each of the drums had to be rolled through the brush to the shore of the cove, loaded onto the craft, which had washed ashore undamaged, then ferried to the plane. There the contents were emptied into the fuel tanks. It was late afternoon before the refueling operation was completed. The boys then made a quick tour of the small island, but found no one hiding there. Jerry, meanwhile, had examined every inch of the plane and reported it to be airworthy. I suggest we take off immediately while we still have some daylight, he said. Soon they were airborne again, headed for Montana. They flew throughout the night. Shortly after daybreak, Jerry landed once to refuel, then set off again. By late morning, he announced that they were over Montana. I'll head for the area indicated on that chart you boys found on the island, said the pilot. When they reached it, he established a search pattern by maneuvering the aircraft into a series of weaving courses. The boys looked with fascination at the twisting valleys and rivers below. Mountains jutted up all around them. Exactly what is it we're looking for? Chet questioned. The gang's hideout would have to be near a long, level stretch of ground which would serve as a runway, Frank answered. This particular area is rugged, so there can't be too many spots for landing. Jerry applied more power and climbed to a higher altitude to clear some of the lower mountains. He continued the search pattern. It's like we're looking for a needle in a haystack, Chet mumbled. Wait a minute, said Frank. Let's take a closer look at that spot over there. He pointed slightly to his right. Jerry rolled into a turn and straightened out in the direction Frank had indicated. See the timber line on the side of that mountain ahead? Frank asked. There's a stretch of level ground right up above it. I see it, Joe exclaimed. And say, there's a shack in the clearing in those woods about half a mile away. The pilot also sighted the spot. He maneuvered the plane closer to the level area. What do you think? Frank asked Jerry. It's level enough and plenty long for a landing. I'd say it would make an ideal runway, and that grove of trees near the far end would be a perfect hiding place for an airplane. Frank suggested that they land and investigate the area. Jerry headed the plane down and flew at a height of less than 100 feet above the ground. The surface looks smooth, he said. I'm going to swing around and make a long approach for a landing. He rolled the plane into a turn and then lined it up with the level stretch of ground, reduced power, extended the landing gear, and lowered full flaps. The craft touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop with plenty of room to spare. Jerry taxied toward the grove of trees, shut off the engines, and parked. The Hardys, followed by the others, got out and glanced around the hard, bare ground. It doesn't look as if anyone's been here before, Frank remarked glumly. I guess we're just on a wild goose chase, Joe said with a frown. Hey, fellas, yelled Chet, who had been reconnoitering an area that sloped away from the grove of trees where the ground was softer. Frank and Joe rushed over to their chum. Look, Chet said, pointing at the ground. Footprints. All the boys examined the tracks closely. The heavy impressions of a man's shoes were clear and led down the slope. The prints were made recently, Joe concluded. Excitedly, the young detectives followed the trail of prints. Lerner and Vogel tagged along a short distance behind. Jerry Madden remained with the plane. Suddenly, Frank stopped and gazed straight ahead. He gestured for everyone to be quiet. Through the trees, they could see a small shack. Motioning Joe to follow him, Frank began to creep toward it. Reaching the shack, the boys peered through a knothole in the wall. What they saw startled them. Seated inside were Lance Peterson and Aaron Lieber. Tensely, the Hardys each pressed an ear to the wall in hopes of overhearing the men's conversation. "Why should we divide the loot equally?" the boys heard Lieber growl. "We did most of the work." "We'll only divvy up what we've already unpacked," Peterson replied. "The stuff we buried in the old dry well won't be missed by the others. We'll keep that for ourselves." "The rest of the guys ought to be flying in soon," Lieber said. This remark startled and worried the boys. They must hurry to capture these men before the new arrivals might capture the Hardys and their companions. When the brothers reported what they'd heard, Lerner and Vogel offered to rush the place and seize Peterson and Lieber. Frank did not agree. "They may be armed," he said. "By the time we broke into the shack, they'd have a chance to use their weapons. Let's get them to come outside." "How?" Joe asked. Frank grinned at his brother, then turned to Chet. "Here's your chance to play ghost." Chet and the Hardys hid behind some brush, located a short distance from the shack. Vogel and Lerner took up concealed positions nearby. "Okay," Frank quickly whispered something to his stout friend. "You're on." Chet cleared his throat, then called out in deep, eerie tones. "This is the ghost of Clint Hill. You cannot escape a man that you have killed." A second later, Peterson and Lieber bolted from the shack. Terror-stricken, they looked around. "Ah, the ghost! It's the ghost!" Peter screamed. "We've got to get away!" Lerner and Vogel sprang out from a bush, leaping on the two thieves. They quickly overpowered them. What's going on?" Lieber shouted, dumbfounded. The captured men were even more startled to see the Hardys striding toward them. "What are you two doing here?" Lieber yelled. "How did you find us?" blurted Peterson. "And where's the ghost?" "Never mind," said Frank. "Who else is in the gang with you?" "Pooh, we're not talking," growled Lieber. "If you won't tell us, we'll find out anyway," said Frank. "Bush Barney and Anchor are in jail. We know some more of your pals are due here shortly." The prisoners glanced at each other apprehensively. They were herded into the shack, seated in chairs and their hands tied firmly behind their backs. Frank said that he and Joe would guard the two captives. He instructed Lerner, Vogel, and Chet to go back and warn Jerry that more members of the gang were flying in. "Make sure our own plane is hidden," Frank commanded. "Then wait there and nab whoever arrives." Alone with Peterson and his henchman, the Hardys began to question them. Peterson offered to make a deal, but the boys refused to listen. The only concession Frank would make was that it might go easier for the men if they would cooperate. That seemed to make up Peterson's mind. "I can give you a complete list of everybody who's in this with us," he said, "and how the whole operation worked. You'll find it all in that metal box up there on the top shelf." He nodded toward the opposite end of the room. Frank walked over to the shelf Peterson had indicated. He looked up at the box. It wasn't very large, but difficult to reach. "I'll give you a hand," Joe said, coming over. Uh-oh. They stepped closer and began lifting the box. The next instant, there was a click, and suddenly the floor beneath their feet gave way. A trap door! The boys plunged helplessly into a dark hole. Oh my goodness. Landing with a thud on soft ground some 10 feet below, the Hardys scrambled up just as the door slammed shut above them. At once they became aware of a hissing sound in the darkness. "What's that odor?" Joe asked frantically. "It must be some kind of gas, Joe." In the room above, they heard the two men break into raucous laughter. As the hissing sound continued, the boys realized with horror that they were losing consciousness. Shall we keep going? Chapter 20. Let's do Runway Victory. Runway Victory. Meanwhile, Chet and the two men had arrived back at the plane. Jerry was amazed to hear that Peterson and Lieber had been captured. "And more members of the gang are expected to land here at any time," Chet added. "Frank says to hide the plane." "We'd better push it under the trees," Jerry said. Together they rolled the aircraft deep into the little grove. Then they watched the sky and waited. "I hope there aren't too many of them," Chet said nervously. Nearly an hour passed before the droning sound of an airplane was heard in the distance. "There it is!" Jerry shouted. "Let's take cover." They watched the craft as it circled and headed in for a landing. The pilot set the plane down gently, then taxied toward the grove. The plane came to a stop and 3 men climbed out. "One of those men is Rodak's," Vogel whispered. "He worked at the Stanwide plant." "And I've seen the short guy around the plant too," added Lerner. "Name's Unger. He's one of the shipping clerks." Neither he nor Vogel recognized the 3rd man who had piloted the plane. "I don't recognize him either," said Jerry. The 3 men started walking toward the trees. When they sighted the amphibian, they came to an abrupt stop. "I didn't know we had another plane working with us," Rodax was heard to say. The men walked forward for a closer look. "Let's get them," Chet whispered. He and the others leaped on the thieves. Rodax and his companions were caught completely unawares. They were quickly subdued, almost without a struggle. "What is this?" bellowed Rodax. At that instant, Chet had an idea. He realized that Rodax and the other 2 henchmen had never seen him before. However, they did recognize Jerry Madden, Lerner, and Vogel as employees of Stanwide. Perhaps if the thieves were led to believe that Peterson and Lieber had talked them into coming in on the deal without their confederates' knowledge, it might make Rodax and the others angry enough to talk. "You might call it a double-cross," Chet said. "Double-cross? What do you mean?" Rodax demanded. The man Lerner had recognized as a shipping clerk appeared greatly alarmed. "Maybe Peterson brought these guys in on the deal," he said, "and plans to push us out." "Is that right?" Rodax shouted angrily. "Why don't you ask Peterson and Lieber about that?" Chet taunted with a grin. "Ask them about the little, agreement we made with them." Jerry and the others quickly caught on to what Chet was trying to do and played along. "If those guys did double-cross us, it'll be just too bad for them," shouted Rodax. He was now in a furious mood. The 3 thieves were marched off to the shack. As they approached, Peterson and Lieber, who had freed themselves from their bonds, came running out the door. "It must be true," growled Rodax. He leaped toward Peterson with clenched fists and knocked him to the ground. The shipping clerk rushed at Lieber. The pilot didn't attempt to join in, but merely stood watching nervously. "Let them fight it out among themselves," yelled Chet. Concerned about the Hardys, he ran into the shack. "Frank!" he called in a worried voice. "Joe!" Chet rushed outside. "Jerry!" he cried out. "Frank and Joe are gone!" Exhausted from their violent struggle, the 4 thieves painfully got to their feet. "What's happened to the Hardys?" Chet demanded angrily. Peterson and Lieber remained silent. "Let's tie them up," said Jerry. Peterson and the others were taken into the shack, firmly bound and seated in chairs. Chet searched the room. He was in a frenzy. "You'd better tell us where the Hardys are," Jerry said angrily, addressing Peterson and Lieber. "Otherwise—" Still the men refused to speak. The strange pilot, who'd been getting more nervous by the minute, finally broke down. "I was dragged into this racket," he yelled. "I don't want to go to jail. I'll turn state's evidence." "What's your name?" Chet asked him. "Kyle Rodney," he responded, "and I've been in this shack before. They have a trap door in the floor over by those wood shelves with a special catch that automatically releases when anyone steps on the door. Lieber designed it that way in case snoopers did come here. Before stepping on it himself, he locked it. Your friends are probably down below." "Shut up," growled Lieber. Chet, with the aid of Lerner and Vogel, pushed hard on the trap door. It swung downward. "I smell gas!" Chet exclaimed. "It's harmless," Lieber said. "When the trap door opens, it uncorks a bottle rigged to the underside." Chet peered into the hole. "There they are!" he shouted. "They're unconscious." "Only asleep," Peterson put in. "That gas wouldn't hurt anybody." Chet grabbed a length of rope, handed one end of it to Lerner and Vogel, then lowered himself to where Frank and Joe were lying. He quickly looped the rope under Frank's arms and called to the men to haul up the young sleuth. Then it was Joe's turn. The boys were carried outside the shack. After several minutes in the fresh air, the Hardys began to regain consciousness. "What happened?" Frank murmured in a weak voice. "You and Joe fell through a trap door in the shack," explained Chet. "Some kind of gas was released that knocked you both out." "Oh, yes, I remember now," Frank said, holding his head. "Oh." Then he sat bolt upright. "How's Joe?" he asked. "Okay," Chet assured him. "He's just a little groggy." Lucky that gas wasn't deadly. Within a few more minutes, the boys had fully recovered. They went into the shack and questioned their prisoners. Why did you steal Clint Hill's airplane? The one we found in the cave, Frank asked. The captured men glared at the young sleuth in silence. Frank decided to play a hunch. That hoist in the plane, you used it to transfer the stolen goods while in flight, didn't you? Slyly, he played on Peterson's vanity. I have to hand it to you. That was some trick. How did you manage it? It was simple. I got the idea after watching some newsreel films on air-to-air refueling, Peterson boasted. Too late, he realized that he'd been tricked into confessing. With nothing further to lose, he began to spell out the details of the scheme, as if wanting the boys and their friends to admire his cleverness. I stole Hill's plane to use in the operation, and we rigged a hoist to it. When we planned the job, I'd arranged to fly the equipment at night so we wouldn't be seen. Then Kyle Rodney, in a hoist plane, would rendezvous with me over some predetermined point, lower a light cable, and we'd transfer a few boxes of platinum parts from the standby plane to his. I had to do it, exclaimed Rodney. Peterson found out that I'd once been in trouble with the law and served a prison term. I was afraid I'd lose my pilot's license. Your hoisting operation was pretty risky, wasn't it? Jerry asked. It was the only way, Peterson confessed. If I'd had to land the cargo plane to unload the stuff, the delay would have shown up on my flight plan. That would have been a dead giveaway. Lieber stared at Peterson. He was flushed with anger at his partner's betrayal. After the air-to-air heist, continued Peterson, ignoring him, Rodney would fly the stuff to our cave hideout. Bush Barney and Anchor would then set up a roadblock to prevent motorists from using the road near the cave for fear they might see the plane land in the pasture. If a motorist ignored the roadblock, they would set off flares to warn Rodney not to come in. So it was you who hit our car with the wheels of your plane that night that we drove along the road, Frank said accusingly to Rodney. That was an accident, Rodney answered. Bush Barney was late in lighting the flare, and I was too low to pull up and go around. Peterson then asked the Hardys a question. How did you learn about this hideout? That was easy, Frank replied. We found an air chart on Ile de la Mer with a course to this place marked on it. You fool, Lieber bellowed at Peterson. Why'd you have to forget that chart? What were you doing on Ile de la Mer? Frank asked Peterson. Did you hide any loot there? No, Peterson responded. We planned to use it as a hideout, but then we changed our minds. We were afraid Mr. Allen might decide to send another exploratory team there. Bunglers, mumbled Rodax. Then I remembered this spot, Peterson continued. My grandfather used to bring me hunting here when I was a kid. I thought it would make a perfect hideout. We hightailed it from Ile de la Mer so fast I forgot to take the chart I'd plotted the flight on. Who threw the hand grenade at us? Joe asked angrily, remembering their close call at the Samwide hangar. Well, that was Rodax, Peterson said quickly, eager to disclaim responsibility for the brutal attack. And it was his idea to get you boys to my office so he could have Lieber steal your camera and films from the plane. You'll find the camera in a Bayport pawn shop. Shut up, shouted Rodax. Joe, taking a guess, said, Zim, too, worked with you. He spied on us and covered Clint Hill's prints at the hangar in case he was still alive and we might trace him. Also, Zim tried to drop that hunk of machinery on us in the warehouse. Yes, Peterson replied. Frank turned to Lieber. Your brother-in-law is innocent, isn't he? You just used him for a dupe. Yes. The Hardys asked Peterson the location of the dry well where he and Lieber had hidden the loot they intended to keep for themselves. On hearing this bit of treachery, Rodax and the shipping clerk were ready to tear Peterson and Lieber apart. Frank whispered to Jerry Madden that he should summon the state police on the plane's radio and also request them to relay word to Bayport Police Headquarters to have Zim arrested. The pilot left the shack. A few minutes later he returned and nodded to the young sleuth that he'd been successful. Before long, a large Montana police helicopter arrived and the thieves were taken into custody. As Peterson left, he stopped for an instant and turned to the boys. Remember, he said threateningly, Clint Hill's ghost is still on the loose. You never solved that mystery. No, but we mean to learn the truth, Frank answered, and added, You left a note to Lieber in that cabin saying the ghost knew too much, didn't you? Yes, I got a lot of radio messages that were, too revealing. They came over to my office set that was always tuned into Unicom. Peterson would not explain any further. When the Hardys and their friends returned to Bayport, they received a joyous homecoming. Mr. Allen was overwhelmed by the sleuthing ability of the boy detectives. Frank and Joe refused to accept the handsome check he offered them, but said that their friend Chet would settle for the biggest meal he could find in Bayport. 2 days later, the brothers received a telephone call from Mr. Allen asking them to come to his office. When they arrived, his secretary looked at them with a big smile. "Go right in," she said. As the boys opened the door to Mr. Allen's office, they were astounded to hear someone whistling High Journey. "Come in," said Mr. Allen as he rose from behind his desk. He nodded toward a bearded young man at the end of the room. "Meet Clint Hill, boys." The Hardys stood speechless for a moment, unable to believe their ears. Clint Hill shook hands with them, then after they all sat down, he began to relate his story. "As you know, Peterson and I and our passengers crashed at sea during a return flight from Ile de Mer. After we hit the water, the three mineralogists. No, mineralogists. Okay. After we hit the water, the three mineralogists drowned almost instantly. Peterson took the one available life raft and left me clinging to the wing of the plane. I was slightly injured and couldn't swim after him." "What did Peterson hope to gain by abandoning you?" Frank asked, curiously. "As he paddled off in the raft he shouted to me that now he would become chief pilot of Stanwide, and that he would fix Mr. Allen. Then I fainted. I must have unconsciously clung to a piece of wreckage, because the next thing I knew I was on an island being cared for by some natives. They spoke only their own language, which I couldn't understand." "Lucky the natives were friendly," Frank said. "Oh, yes," Clint replied. "After I recovered they took me to another bigger island in a dugout canoe. It was there that I managed to get a job and earn enough money to buy boat passage back to the United States. I decided to keep my identity a secret and stay in hiding until I found out what Peterson was up to. I didn't even get in touch with Mr. Allen. I wanted to be sure of my ground before making any accusations." "When did you decide to become a ghost?" asked Joe, grinning. "I knew Peterson was superstitious," the pilot said, "so I got a job with the ground crew at a field near Bayport. I began to bug him with the ghost business, hoping to make him confess not only that he'd left me to die, but what he was doing to fix Mr. Allen." "Great idea," Frank said with a chuckle. "It even had us worried for a while. I guess Peterson asked us to work for him to throw us off the track. By the way, was it you who wore a mask one night at Zim's house and gave me a punch?" "Was that you?" Hill asked, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I thought it was one of the Peterson pals." "No harm done," Frank grinned. "Go on with your story." "After I'd been here a while," Clint continued, "I took the airport operator I was working for into my confidence. He allowed me the use of an airplane to do some investigating, and I succeeded in tracking Peterson to Anchor's cabin, but I couldn't find the cave. I see you boys did, though. And when he skipped, I phoned your house to find out where he'd gone, but you tried to bargain with me, and of course I couldn't do that." "No," Frank laughed, "of course you couldn't." The young pilot congratulated the Hardys on the fine job they had done in uncovering Peterson's scheme against Mr. Allen. The boys felt gratified, but longed to solve another mystery. It was to come as they worked to find out the riddle of a story about what happened at midnight. Mr. Allen heartily echoed Clint Hill's praise. "And since you Hardy boys are the best sleuths in the business," Mr. Allen added, "you've probably figured out that you're now looking at Stanwide's permanent chief pilot. That is," he added, with a grin in Clint's direction, "if our ghost gets around to shaving off those whiskers."